Guys, welcome to the Unit 3 lecture, the video lecture. Go ahead and take notes as we are going through this section talking about these different land-based empires. So Unit 3 is often referred to as the land-based empires. It takes place in the years 1450 to 1750. So if you'll notice that this Unit 3 and Unit 4 are going to have an overlap of time periods. They're both going to happen congruently. So they're going to happen at the same time, 1450 to 1750, similarly to how we saw Units 1 and Unit 2, both hitting that 1200 to 1400 kind of timeline there. So we're going to see the maritime empires are going to be very similar, but they're going to be, instead of land-based, they're going to be maritime or sea-based empires. Pay close attention to the dates in this unit because 1450 should ring a bell because 1453 is a must-know date when it comes to AP. 1453 is the year that the Byzantine capital falls to the Ottomans, which marks the end of one era and the beginning of another. When we look at the next unit, Unit 4, you'll see 1492 is a date you probably have heard of before. It's also going to serve as one of those must-know dates that marks the end of an era and onto another one. All right, so this unit is divided up into themes, and all these themes talk about how these empires started and how these empires operated. So the first one really talks about how these empires started. That's the first real big theme. And we're not going to cover too much of this one. You should know a little bit about these from your notes already, but this is the first one is going through each of these individual empires. The second thing we're going to look at is how they operated, how these empires actually ruled, how they were able to administer, how they were able to actually function. And then lastly, what we're going to look at is the influence of belief systems. And all these are the major themes. And we're going to, instead of talking about each individual empire, what we're going to do is kind of compare and talk about these major themes between them. So let's take a look right here at this map. You see a major focus on the eastern part of the world. It's the same place we saw in Unit 2. The empires that are very powerful in Unit 3 almost completely overlap the areas that were centers for trade in Unit 2. That is not a coincidence. That's very intentional. We do see some new players such as Russia and the return of some old ones like the Inca and the Aztecs. There's some major trends to kind of pay attention to. There's some new military weapons, obviously, as we often refer to as gunpowder empires, which are going to make wars much more decisive. You're going to have the increase in the size of these empires. This is not the first time we've had empires, but it's definitely the first time that we've had empires of this size, and then having so many of them that are this large. You're going to have the collapse of nomadic empires like the Mongols, which is going to leave room for landed empires to kind of grow and expand. They take over a lot of that old Mongol territory. And there's going to be a continued spread of major religions associated with these empires. So religion is going to play a big influence as well. Lastly, you're going to see these empires start to use religious ideas to solidify their rule. So in the first unit, in Unit 0, we kind of talked about the origin of these religions. In Unit 1 and Unit 2, we talked about the spread of these religions with trade routes. This unit, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at religion, but how it's used to keep those who are already in power in power. They're going to use this religious ideas to justify their rule, and they're also going to wage conflicts against other rulers of different religions. So we start to see this impact of the Crusades, where you have this conflict between religion is going to take place. Okay, so the question is, what is a land-based empire? By the name, it may seem pretty obvious, and to an extent, it is. But there are a few key features of these empires. The first, the term land-based empire, as it's defined when it comes to AP World History, refers to empires which existed during this time period, 1450 to 1750. Although some did exist before and continue to exist after, most are pretty much confined to this period. Number two, these empires were land-based, meaning they focused their attention predominantly on land expansion or administration and did not express interest in controlling overseas territory. Why? Well, that's kind of complicated and unique to each individual empire, but some reasons are this idea of like long-term conflict with other land-based powers, which focus attention on what's happening on land. They also had issues such as regions didn't have a history of a navy, not really. For example, merchants may have done most of their trading by land. That's just kind of their history. And lastly, you had these settled nomads who were not interested in overseas expansion, ruled a few of these states. This rule obviously has some exceptions, like the Ottoman, the Ming, the French empires all had navy expeditions. Japan launched a major, or the Tokugawa shogunate launched a major seaboard invasion of Korea. But overall, these states focused pretty much on land-based expansion. Pointing out those things would actually be a very, very excellent complexity point in an essay, is to kind of mention that. These were, and lastly, these were empires, and while each empire was ran slightly different with different systems of administration or taxation of military technology, they were all absolute monarchies. So these should not be confused with democracies or representative governments that we're going to see a little bit later on. They are a single ruled emperor or king. All right. So the first thing we're going to talk about here is this idea of absolutism. So when we left off with Europe, we were talking about the plague. So out walks the plague, in walks the plague, out walks feudalism, right? So feudalism is kind of on its way out in Europe. And the question that becomes, how do these European kings and emperors convince the people of Europe that they're the boss if the old way of doing things doesn't work anymore? So the answer, Cribs, medieval edition. And if you don't like that, well, then you can tell the people because God said so. So before we get into this, let's take a look at some Roman numerals. As you know, many families like to pass their names of ancestors to their children. You might yourself or have a close family member that is named after a father, a mother, a grandfather, a grandmother, etc. No one liked this more than European kings. In England, you would have names like Henry or Edward. In Russia, you would have Peter or Nicholas. And in France, you had Louis. And you had a lot of Louis, like 14 of them. So speaking of rich people, let's take a look at some of the houses of the richest people of the world today. So this first one, you might have heard of her before. This is the House Promised Land, Oprah Winfrey's house. Right here. Not too bad for having her own show. The richest self-made woman in the USA. You've got the richest person in the world, Bill Gates, in his Xanadu 2.0 in Bel Air, LA. Cool, $147 million, pretty humble, 147. The inventor of Microsoft. You've got Larry Ellison, the inventor of a computer software company, Oracle, has the Ellison estate. A lot of California you're going to see here. And this one right here is for sale. This is the billionaire house, the most expensive house in the United States, $250 million. As you can see, all the awesome things that you might want here. So if you have a cool $250 million, you might want to check this one out. And then lastly, the most expensive house on earth is in Mumbai, India, and Antilia. And Antilia is a guy, very, very expensive media conglomerate, runs Reliance Industries, just has a bunch of different businesses. And this guy, Mukesh Ambani, has a very, very, very nice pad in the top of downtown India right there. So, but no one can hold a candle to a snob. No other person personifies a snobby rich person other than French King Louis XIV. He rules France at arguably the height of its power and rules France through the idea of divine right. And this is the belief that the leaders of Europe are the leaders because they have a royal bloodline that must remain pure. So sorry to anyone who wasn't an aristocrat or a rich person. And also they've been chosen by God right there through the Pope. So they realize that feudalism is vanishing. So instead of opening up the country up to more rights to the people, he decides that he's going to centralize the power of the nobles all the way around the crown. So try to take the power back, so to speak. He wants more power and he gets it, along with a boatload of tax money right here. Since Louis was such a man of the people, he realizes that if the common people don't respect their rich king, then they should respect his dope pad. So he builds the largest, most elaborate, most expensive palace in the world because nothing screams that I understand your struggle more than 2,300 bedrooms. And no, I am not exaggerating. There are 2,300 bedrooms at the Palace of Versailles. So today's houses are nice, but none of them hold power on the Sun King himself, Louis the 16th. So let's take a look at what he built. Louis the 14th. So here all was the power. This was the palace. It was centralized all here. This was the main wing, and it was built on Louis the 13th's old hunting lodge. So this was basically just a place for the kings of France to go and hunt all their fancy animals on horseback and crazy things like that. But he decides he's going to make it his dope pad. So it costs an untold billions of dollars. It's made with all French materials, and nobility had to actually live on site. So this is unique to feudalism, which, remember, you gave the nobles the different kingdoms and castles and barons and stuff like that. He decides, no, I want them all in my pocket. I want them right next door to me. So he actually has them live in the palace next to him. So let's take a look right here at this video and think about, how does Versailles serve as a symbol of absolute rule?
Versailles wasn't built in a day. It all began in 1629, when King Louis XIII had a hunting lodge built, replaced sometime later by a stone and brick chateau. King Louis XIV inherited this small chateau. In 1666, the sovereign embarked on major building work. Over 50 years, he continued to extend and transform what became Europe's largest chateau, the Palace of Versailles. Architect Louis Deveau designed two symmetrical grand apartments for the king and the queen. Louis XIV moved his government and court to Versailles. After a new program of works, Jules Hardouin Mansart replaced the terrace overlooking the grounds by the Hall of Mirrors, which became the court's main ceremonial reception room. Mansart further extended the palace to accommodate the royal family, the court, and all the government departments. With the servants, the kitchen, and stable staff, close to 10,000 people were bustling about the palace. At the end of his reign, Louis XIV moved his bedchamber to the center of the palace. This room was the hub of the king's daily ceremonial routine and that of all the Versailles courtiers. Towering over the other buildings, a royal chapel was finally built by Mansart on the same scale as the palace. When King Louis XV moved to Versailles, he broke with strict court etiquette and fitted out smaller apartments for more comfort and privacy. At the end of his reign, Louis XV built what the palace was missing, a real opera house. Architect Gabriel modernized the facades closest to the town. In 1789, the French Revolution forced the royal family to leave Versailles for Paris. The future of the palace looked uncertain.
So now you feel like a real French royal. All right, so let's take a look at what was going on in this kind of overview of this one. So we got a ton of big new land empires are popping up in this period. The ones that you need to know, and we're going to look at a little bit later, the Ottomans, the Safavids, the Mughals, the Manchu, also known as the Qing, and then the Russian Empire. Also, don't forget, we still have the Incas and the Aztecs. They're hanging around. They're destroyed early on, but, you know, they still count towards the beginning of this land-based empire look. The section wants you to know about their expansion, so it's important to know how they started. So that's really what 3.1 is kind of talking about there. These are big empires that will last for many units going forward. So it's really, really important that we don't skip this section so we understand kind of what's happening a little bit later on in history. So let's take a look at 3.2 right here, which is talking about how these empires operated. So we're going to see a lot of administration based on religious justification. And then we're going to see one side is going to use religious justification. On the other side, we're going to see is going to be based on military elites. So we're going to see the divine right of kings in the French Empire, the mandate of heaven in China. The Songhai are going to use Islam. The Devshirme, so those are all like the religious systems that are going to justify their rule. On the other side, you've got the military elites. You've got the Devshirme system in the Ottoman Empire. You got the samurai warriors in Japan. So you see how they're using kind of two different angles here. So how governments maintain their legitimacy varies across empires, but as you can see from those different examples above, there's two general ways that empires claim the right to rule. On one side, there's military elites, refers to a system of warriors who are loyal to the ruler of the state, which helps them maintain their power. On the other hand, some states relied more on religious justification for their power, claiming direct connection to the gods as the right to rule. It should be understood, though, that these two often overlap. There's a lot of connection between the two of these right here. So let's take a look at the big one first. The first big one here is guns. Many of these empires that are also known in AP World and in many textbooks use the phrase gunpowder empires because they were some of the first to use gunpowder armies in mass several hundred years before Europe. So oftentimes we associate Europeans with muskets and machine guns and rifles, but no. It was these land-based empires that really kicked off the use and benefited from the use of gunpowder. In the early days of gunpowder, it was a very technical craft. An empire needed a large, skilled population to cast the metal parts for weapons and to manufacture actual gunpowder itself. Training soldiers in gunpowder weaponry also took a lot of time and money, which is why you see an overlap here with the trade empires, the ones that first come up with gunpowder. And money only a large empire would actually have. But even smaller states like the Tokugawa shogunate in Japan owed their success to carefully trained use of gunpowder weapons. The first gunpowder weapons were used by the Song dynasty in China, but the Islamic empires, the Ottomans, the Mughals, the Safavids, and Qing China were the first to utilize them to a huge extent. The capture of Constantinople by the Ottomans and the conquest of Central Asia by the Qing in the late 1600s both owed their success to gunpowder weapons. Later, after 1800, industrial weapon manufacturing would give Europe a pretty decisive edge in this regard. But don't forget, it was the gunpowder empires, it was these land-based empires that were the first to come up and use on this big extent. All right, so the third gunpowder empire is India's Mughal Empire, often perhaps the most dramatic example of modern weaponry actually winning over an empire. There was this guy Babur who founded the empire, and he was able to defeat the last Delhi Sultanate. So remember, India at this time is ruled by Muslims. It is not ruled by Hindus, and that's a very, very important key feat. And so during this battle, Babur had the expertise of his commander, who actually had learned about this weaponry and this use through Ottoman technicians. This guy's victory, Babur's victory in Central Asia's army, used a combination of horse cavalry tactics, I see you Mongols, and these new fangled cannons. The cannon fire spooked the war elephants that were used by the Delhi Sultanate, which turned and trampled their own army in their hurry to escape the fearsome noise. After this victory, it was rare for any forces to engage the Mughals in an actual battle. So really won them the war was these giant cannons, scaring away these unfortunately terrified elephants. So on the other side, some empires relied really, really heavily on their military establishments to run their empires, and sometimes this included the bureaucracy. So this is like the paperwork, the keeping records. the boring stuff. So the Ottoman Empire, the Devshirme system, is an example of this. Children were not of the dominant religion. If they were not Islamic, they were recruited and they received both military and academic education. And sometimes they were assigned to either lead on the battlefield with the latest weapons as a janissary or to help run the government in the capital. This system was very flexible and it recruited only the best. Even better for the empire. These positions were initially not hereditary, so you couldn't be born to them. So the empire did not develop another power base to actually rival the sultan like you would have in Europe with the nobles. However, a problem arose when the janissaries were allowed to pass their position to their children or to even have children by the late 1600s. That's what's going to happen with the Ottomans. On the other side, you have in the Safavid, or in Persia, the Qizilbash. And the Qizilbash were a coalition of many different tribes of predominantly, but not just, Turkic-speaking background. And they're going to be united because they are all going to have this Shia Islamic religion. So they're going to be, that's what they're going to find their kind of commonality. They're going to be provided military support to secure their borders because Persia kind of goes right up to the Ottoman Empire. The Safavid and the Ottomans are going to be fighting a lot. And in return, the Qizilbash get vast grazing rights. So these guys basically are like, listen, you serve and you be totally loyal to the Shah, the Emperor of Persia, and we will give you kind of like these prime land to be able to farm and grow it and kind of become more powerful. The expression is derived, and the term Qizilbash actually means red hats, and it comes from the distinctive 12-gored crimson headwear that they would wear on top of their head. And then in India, you had the Mughal Empire, which again is going to be Islamic, at least the emperors were, maybe not the people. And you have the Zamindar in India. And it actually comes from the word dar, which means holder, and then land, which comes from the word zaman. So land holder is kind of the word for this. The root words come from Persia, not really Hindu, and the resulting name was widely used wherever Persian influence was spread by the Mughals or Indian Muslim dynasties. The meanings attached to it were pretty various. In India, the word denoted kind of like a hereditary tax collector. So someone who was, their father was a tax collector, they're a tax collector, their son's going to be a tax collector. And they could retain 10% of the revenue that they collected. So you're kind of thinking some similarities between the Ottoman tax farming. In the late 1700s, the 1700s, eventually the British are going to make these zamindars actual landholders, thus creating a little bit of a rich class in India that's going to last until Indian independence. But that's going to be a little bit later on. But it's important to note that these guys are the ones who kind of administer the government of the Mughal Empire. All right. And then in Russia, you have the boyars. And the boyars are the members of the upper class of medieval Russian society, and they kind of play a major role in state government. So from about the 1400s to 1600s, the boyars formed a closed aristocratic class that surrounded the throne of the Grand Prince, who is later going to become the Tsar of Russia. And they're going to rule the country together with him. So they're drawn from about 200 families, and they're descended from former princes, old boyar families, and foreign aristocrats. The rank of boyar did not actually belong, though, to all members of these families. It wasn't like Europe, where everyone was born an aristocrat, but only those senior members to whom the Tsar himself granted the title. So they were actually very loyal to the Tsar because they had to get that title granted to them in exchange for their loyalty. All right, and then in China, you had the banner system, and this is also known as the Qi or the Pachi system. And it was how they organized their military, and this was how the Manchus were able to take over so much land. So this is now the Manchu tribes, which is now northeast China. And they were able to conquer and control China in the 1600s. As the Manchu increased their conquest, the size of these armies grew and grew until they had all these different companies that had about 7,500 men, and they would divide them up into regiments, divided in turn into companies. And all the emperor's followers, with the exception of a few princes, were organized into this banner system, which also served not only as a military group, but also as they collected taxes, they got more soldiers to join up, they registered the population, and they carried out all the organization of the day-to-day. The bannermen actually lived, farmed, and worked with their families during times of peace, and in times of war, each banner contributed a certain number of fighting men. After the establishment of the dynasty, a police force army, also known as the Army of the Green Standard, was questioned throughout the country to quell minor disturbances. Sorry. This army consisted mainly of former Ming soldiers and local forces. The main Manchu force continued to have the 24, which were serving around Beijing, and they kind of served as a go-to army in case there was ever an emergency. They were kind of considered a form of nobility. They were given preferential treatments in terms that had annual pensions. They could get land, and they actually got a pension of rice and clothing. And Manchu bannermen were on the whole, were trained way better than their Mongol and Chinese counterparts, but were prohibited from participating in trade and manual labor unless they petitioned to remove their banner status. So it was a very, very high regard in this one. And lastly, we've got the Ottomans. And the Ottomans are going to use art and architecture to legitimize their rule. So we've seen how they have this group of elites. Now we're going to see how they have these empires use art and architecture to legitimize their rule. So what the Ottomans would do is they would have these Persian or Ottoman miniatures, and it kind of started from Persia because the Persian sultans did it. But Mehmed II had these royal workshops, and basically what they did is they didn't just paint pictures of the ruler, they would paint pictures showing the functions of what the ruler did during the day. So kind of like to maybe humanize or to show the level of work that went into being the ruler of the Ottoman Empire. And so it wasn't so much of as let's take a look at them in their ultimate regalia, in their ultimate clothing with their scepter and their crown on. It was more of let's show them hard at work. It was kind of the idea to legitimize the rule. On the other side, you had the Qing imperial portraits. And so basically what happened is all the Qing emperors would basically pay an artist to create these ginormous, nearly life-size portraits of them and their family. And it was this idea, and they were very, very highly regarded, very respected pictures that were to be absolutely honored, that were passed down as kind of like a family line of all the different Qing emperors right here. And so this was used to kind of maintain the image of the emperor. And then you also have also a big part of architecture. So kind of we saw how art was used. Now we're going to look at how architecture was used. In both the Inca and the Mughal Empire, rulers used religion to help reinforce their rule. So in the Inca Empire, which is the capital of Cusco, the Inca capital, there were major gold-covered sun temples constructed high above most of the city, allowing the rulers to conduct these huge, elaborate ceremonies in full view of their subjects. This reinforced the rulers' connections to the sun god, Inti. Later, the Spanish tore down the temple and built a church on top of it to emphasize the victory of Christianity over the Inca Empire. But we'll talk about them a little bit in the next unit. In the Mughal Empire, you would have a number of mausoleums, which were tombs built to reflect traditional Persian and Islamic architecture. So much so that the Mughal architecture became its very own category of Islamic architecture in South Asian history. There's never been a type of architecture that was kind of looked this way. The most well-known example, you've probably heard of it before, is the Taj Mahal, which was built as a tomb for a Mughal emperor's wife. It has the appearance kind of like as a mosque with the dome and the minarets, and the interior is literally covered in excerpts from the Quran, the holy book of Islam. These all serve to reinforce the faithfulness of the Mughal rulers to Islam. And then over here, we kind of talked about this one already, but this idea of the palaces and how the Europeans were able to do this. The Palace of Versailles in France was built by Louis XIV, while probably known mostly for its rooms and fancy balls and large-scale gardens, so large the fountains could not be run 24/7 or they would drain the nearby water source. But the Palace of Versailles was also a parade ground for military demonstrations, and Louis XIV was a king of a newly centralized France, and he kept his nobles in line not only by having them live part of the year in Versailles, but also having military demonstrations in front of them and foreign delegates. So it's a very, very important way to do that there. All right, so looking over kind of how empires operated. Let's take a look. So besides the Mongols, it had been since the early classical period with like the Han Chinese or the Roman Empire that you've had this many large land empires existing at the exact same time. They all use different styles to rule over the masses of people, but sometimes there's a lot of overlap. Some use religion to justify their power, like we saw the divine right in Europe, Shia Islam and the Safavids, Islam and the Songhai, or human sacrifice with the Aztecs. But others used architecture to show that the rulers were legitimate. So you saw the Palace of Versailles in France, the Taj Mahal in the Mughal Empire, or you'd have the Koran Chacha in the Inca Empire. And they also collected taxes in different ways to bring in revenue, like the Taj Mahal. It ain't cheap, and the Palace of Versailles definitely ain't cheap right here. So lastly, what we're going to look at is this idea of social hierarchies, and the social hierarchy based on either race and culture or social hierarchy based on religion. And we're going to see a really huge influence of religion in this unit. So on the one side, if we looked at the social hierarchy based on race and culture, you've got the Qing dynasty, which restricts the policy on the Han Chinese. So the Qing are obviously Manchus, so they don't want a lot of Han Chinese in the government. You have the Spanish Empire. We're going to look at them a little bit later, and they're going to have a system based on race. You're going to have the Ottoman Empire with the Millet system, the Mughal Empire with the Zamindar or the Rajput system are going to be based a little bit more on religion. So you got the Spanish and the Qing, which base more on race and culture, and the Mughals and the Ottomans are going to base more on religion. So organizing a society is essential to maintaining stability within an empire. So a hierarchy determines one's job, what legal rights they had, and how close they could be to power. These hierarchies could be based on physical characteristics. Probably the most famous one we're going to look at is in Unit 4 with the casta system, which was based on perception of how close you were to Spanish blood. Or they could be based on religion, as in many of the Islamic empires, like the Millet system, which gave each religion its own zone to actually believe and worship. Although the Islamic zones were above the others, this did provide some stability as each zone was free to practice their own individual religion. So we're going to focus specifically on these ideas right here. So the first one we're going to look at is a very European idea, but you're going to notice this is not just unique to Europe. And this is the idea of divine right. So sometimes buildings are not enough. And there are other examples of rulers using religion to promote their power, either directly or through their right to rule given by a divine power. The term divine right comes from European history, though the idea is not new. Since the end of the Roman Empire, many European monarchs from Russia to France were claimed to be ruling in the name of the Christian God. This did not mean that the rulers were actual gods, but rather they ruled by the consent of the god or with God's permission. If that sounds familiar, that's because it's almost identical to the idea of the mandate in heaven in ancient imperial China. So, as you can see that from this picture right here, it's got a very much, and you can kind of see the influence of Latin, very much Roman Empire-esque, and you've got the influence of religion kind of solidifying where this rule comes from. All right, so on the other side, we've also got this influence of Safavid or Persian Shiaism. And the largest Shia state that's ever existed in history was the Safavid Empire. And eventually what he would do is, because the predominant religion, like we saw with the Abbasid Empire earlier and throughout much of the Umayyad dynasty in Spain, is going to be Sunni Islam. But Shia Islam is going to play a major role in Persia, and the Safavids themselves are Shia rulers. And so basically what he's going to do is force people to convert to Shia, and he's going to rule as a divine appointed political and religious leader. So he really takes the idea of, it is my duty to spread not only Islam but Shia Islam as well. And they're going to see a major influence from the Safavid Persians and able to legitimize their rule that way. And then you've also got the Aztec Empire, technically, which was a confederation of 3 states, wasn't technically an empire, but the rulers maintained a close relationship with the priest class. Aztec rulers launched campaigns to acquire prisoners of war and human tribute from subject people in order to continue the practice of human sacrifice. And this priest class, which was demanded by the gods, they said. The Aztec Empire was a military state which subjected most of the people in central Mexico in return for tribute in goods, and people calculated via tribute lists. In returns for human sacrifice, Aztec priests legitimized the rule of the various Aztec leaders. It should be noted that this practice was not new in pre-Columbian America, but the volume of how many people the Aztecs sacrificed made them very unpopular among the people in central Mexico, which is eventually going to lead to their downfall, which we'll look at a little bit later. And in Songhai, in the Songhai Empire in Africa, the ruling family promoted Islam, as had their predecessors in Mali and Ghana. But the Songhai rulers brought in more Islamic scholars and more forcefully spread the religion among the people of the empire, which was a change from the rulers of Mali, who did not force their subjects to convert. In an effort to get more people to accept Islam, many of the rulers also took the name Muhammad, after the Islamic prophet. And local Islamic scholars spread a story that the emperor's founder, Muhammad I, or Askia, was a jinn, a type of spirit in Islamic mythology who protected the empire's subjects. And then lastly, you have this idea of the Confucian ritual in China. And so the Manchu, even though they themselves were not traditionally Han Chinese like the previous emperors had been, they used Confucian principles to rule China and encourage acceptance by the rest of China, because at the top of the Confucian pyramid is respect for the ruler. And so even though they were not ethnically Chinese, they were not ethnically Han, they themselves use those Chinese traditions and those Chinese values to legitimize their rules. So, if we're to wrap up, all these empires had belief systems at their core. There are a few new ones in this era. So you have Sikhism in Punjab, which is between the areas of India and Pakistan. And we're going to look a little bit later at Protestantism, which is going to be in Europe, in Northern Europe. Be sure to know, we're going to talk about how the Protestants broke off from the Catholic Church. And this is going to lead to a lot of religious fighting for decades. But the only conflict brought up by the College Board is actually the rivalry between the Sunni and the Shia. And so this is the best scene between all the wars, is between the Ottomans and the Safavids, who are actually going to fight directly, as they are geographically next to each other and religiously two different sects of the religion. And lastly, don't skip the Sikhs. Pronounced Sikh in Punjab, but we pronounce it in the West as Sikh. It's the 5th biggest religion on earth. It's not exactly a mix of Hinduism and Islam. In reality, it takes the truths from Islam and Hinduism and leaves out the rest. So that's going to wrap up the lecture on what's happening between the different land-based empires. Hopefully that kind of explains a little bit of the comparison, and I will see you guys next time.